Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bookmarks. I'm Ruby, and I'm going to be your host for tonight. We're here to talk about an incredible new book, 32 Counties, The Failure of Partition and the Case for a United Ireland. It's really a timely release, 100 years on from partition, and as huge debates and contests continue to emerge from the disastrous consequences of that partition and of British colonialism and imperialism in Ireland. So it's wonderful for us to have Kieran Allen here today to talk about his new book. Kieran Allen is a senior lecturer in sociology at the University College Dublin, and his previous books include 1916, Ireland's Revolutionary Tradition, and The Politics of James Connolly. So I was lucky enough to read the book this week, and I can tell you that it's both a tremendous history book offering a really fascinating and in-depth historical analysis, weaving stories and ideas together, but also throughout what struck me is that it always felt like a kind of a rallying cry and a really hopeful vision for the future that offers really practical and serious tools for action that can win transformative change. So I seriously recommend you all getting a copy from Bookmarks Bookshop, and I'm so happy to hand over to Kieran now to lead us off with a talk.
Okay, thank you, Ruby, and thanks Bookmarks for inviting me here. I'll start really with the events this week, which is that the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, Arlene Foster, has resigned. Now, she resigned because a number of the branches of her party wrote to complain about the fact that she abstained from a vote on conversion therapy, converting gay people into straight people. The vast majority of her party voted for conversion therapy, but the mere fact that she dared not to vote against it, but to abstain, was enough to get her turfed out as leader, or at least one of the reasons which triggered that off. Now, her successor is likely to be a man called Edwin Poots. And when we look at Edwin Poots's views, they are somewhat strange. He believes, for example, that the Earth began 4000 BC, missing by about 250,000 years. He refuses to allow gay people to give blood. He thinks that Catholics are more likely to have COVID than Protestants. In fact, he said the difference between nationalist areas and unionist areas is about 6 times. So they're 6 times more likely to have COVID. Now, you ask yourself, I mean, how could a party like this come to be in a government in most parts of the world? Why such strange politics? And then when you put that with the politics of the South, you find something equally strange, namely that for 100 years, approximately 100 years, the government of Southern Ireland has been run by either Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, which there's absolutely no difference between them. Both parts of Ireland, even though they have relatively strong trade union membership, have never produced even a substantial social democratic party. There's no Labour Party of any substance in this part of the world, in complete distinction to what operates in most other parts of Europe. And really, therefore, this is an indication of what the great Irish socialist James Connolly calls that partition would create a carnival of reaction. It would lead to a situation where the sort of communal leaders of the North and South would rally their population around them. In the North, the Unionists would say, do you really want to be part of a terrible Catholic papist state? And in the South, the leaders would say, do you really not want to take back your Fort Greenfield to end the injustice of partition? And so in this way, even though both of them were mirror images of each other, in reality, they survived like symbiotic twins. Now, as Ruby said, the partition of Ireland the centenary is actually on May the 3rd. The opening of the Stormont Parliament is on the 21st of June. But if we look at the actual history briefly, we find that when the idea of partition was first proposed in the British House of Commons by an MP known as Agar Roberts, it got minimal support. That was in 2012. But yet 9 years afterwards, partition emerges as the main strategy of the British government for dealing with Ireland. Why? And the first reason why that occurred was because partition was used, or was designed to be used, as a bargaining chip to force Ireland back into the British Empire. Ireland at the time was if you like, undergoing a major revolt. And the idea that, you know, there was being told to Irish nationalists, if you dare leave the empire and not accept dominion status, we are actually going to partition you. So in some ways, this shift in the policy of the British elite, it's very important to understand it against the background of the crisis of British imperialism. British imperialism ran the world for many decades. By the beginning of the 20th century, it was facing some problems. It was facing, for example, the Boer War revolts. In 1919, it faced three major rebellions. The Irish Rebellion is one of them. But there was also significant rebellions, mainly led by women in Egypt. A massive massacre, for example, in the Punjab, in India, in Amritsar in 1919. In Britain itself, you have the revolt of the miners, considerable labour unrest. And therefore, in this situation, the Tory party made a decision that it wanted to create a mass base for chauvinism, for support for the empire. And it was this which rallied it around the idea of a united Ireland, a partitioned Ireland. And when we look actually, sometimes you hear Tory politicians talking about how they have a mission to bring democracy to the rest of the world. In reality, the alliance forged between the Tories and Ulster Unionists was one of the most reactionary alliances that has ever been forged right across this part of the world. And it began really in 1912. And again, we should quote the words of Bonner Law when he addressed the mass ranks of the Ulster Volunteers in 1912. He said that the British government, his own government, the English government, which was trying to pass a Home Rule Act, he said, and I'm quoting him, it was a revolutionary committee which has seized power by fraud upon despotic power. In our opposition to them, we shall not be guided by considerations which would influence us in ordinary political struggle. We shall use any means to deprive them of the power they usurped. The future Lord Chancellor, F.E. Smith, said, the Earl of Birkenhead said, that he talked gleefully about ministers, liberal ministers, swinging from the lamppost if they dared carry through with Home Rule. So it's important to understand that the partition of Ireland came out of a crisis in the British Empire, where a section of the ruling class around the Tories decided to forge an alliance with Ulster Unionism on the basis of a profound attack, even on the notion of parliamentary democracy itself. Now, that partition survived for 100 years, and I've pointed out it has had tremendous reactionary consequences for the whole population of Ireland. But now, on the 100th anniversary of partition, it is facing a major crisis. And what we see really in the case of Ulster Unionism is a long-term crisis which is now coming to a head and will come to a head in the coming years. Let me outline three main reasons why there is a crisis in Ulster Unionism and why the whole idea of partition is now subject to major questioning. Now, the first reason is Brexit. Brexit, as you know better than me, was an attempt by the Tories to try to use working class anger and deflect it by talking about kicking out the foreigners, about restoring imperial greatness. And while, if you like, a section of the Tory party may indeed believe that they could go down this route, in reality, what they've done is they have not just broken Britain away from the EU, they have also set the stage ready for the breakup of the UK itself. Brexit has in the Tory version of Brexit, has been linked to essentially the growth of English nationalism. The Financial Times this week reports, for example, that a study conducted by the Edinburgh University shows that 3/4 of English Conservative voters would accept Scotland's departure as a price worth paying for Brexit. And therefore, if Scotland goes, part of the beginning of a breakup of the UK, which hopefully may start with the election in the coming days, Northern Ireland will be set to follow. But in fact, there are more specific reasons why Brexit is having a deep destabilizing effect in the north. And it's this. In 2018, Boris Johnson came to the Democratic Unionist Party conference, And at that time, he was trying to forge an alliance between the hard right of the Tory party and the Ulster Unionists. And he told them, and I'm quoting him, he says that under no condition would he, Boris Johnson, accept the idea of a border down the Irish Sea. He said this would turn Northern Ireland, I'm quoting him, into an economic semi-colony of the EU. He went on to say, we would be damaging the fabric of the Union with regulatory checks and even custom controls between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I have to tell you that no British government could or should sign up to this arrangement. Boris Johnson, being Boris Johnson, was simply lying. 11 months later, he did precisely that. He agreed to a border in the Irish Sea, and he agreed to do something which he claimed no British government would ever do because it would mean the destruction of the Union. And that reason alone, because the DUP were so enamored by Johnson, would give him such a reception, kept Theresa May in power, that has led to a major crisis in terms of the DUP, reflected in the fact they have now got rid of Arlene Foster. An opinion poll, for example, in February of this year indicates that the DUP vote in Northern Ireland has declined to 19% of the vote. They will come second place to Sinn Féin. The prospect of a Sinn Féin leader of a state, the six-county state, Sinn Féin pledged to overthrow it, has become a real prospect with the decline of the DUP. The second reason, however, why partition is under question is of developments in the South. You see, when you actually read about the history of partition, the whole basis of it is that the Protestant people of Ulster had a right to be protected from a vociferous Catholic mob who were run by the Pope, who had ambitions to take their land, and were completely dominated by the bishops, the priests, and the cardinals. And in many ways, that playing of the idea of the South is a backward, conservative, Catholic country was very much central to the ideology of Unionism. You look today, and I'm not least being patriotic, there are very many things to criticize in the South, but you actually look what's actually happened. The Southern Ireland was the first country in the world to vote for marriage equality by popular suffrage, not just passing into Parliament, but by a referendum. Southern Ireland, despite the huge and enormous efforts of the Catholic Church, voted by 2/3 effectively to legalise abortion. And therefore, what we find emerging in Southern Ireland is these enormous social movements which keep on pushing the Catholic Church back, which are demanding, why are they in control of sex education in schools? Why are they controlling the schools? Why are people forced to learn the Catholic religion in schools? So these movements are, if you like, destroying the idea that somehow the South is run by papists who obey the Pope and who have nothing in common with people in Northern Ireland. And the third reason why partition is in trouble at the moment, and why unionism generally is in trouble, has to do with the fact that the unionist parties, astoundingly, have actually become a minority within Northern Ireland since the 2017 election. Remember, unionism is a party which from the beginning of the state, until 1972, this effectively was a one-party state where never was any bill passed that came from the opposition, the exception being the Wild Birds Act, I think, of 1934 or wherever. Wild Birds presumably being neither Catholic nor Protestant. That was the only bill ever passed. Now, the unionist parties are a minority inside Northern Ireland. And then when you look at what's going to happen in the next month or so, the census is going to show that Protestants are also a minority within Northern Ireland. Now, in most normal societies, who cares whether somebody's a Protestant or a Catholic? Who cares whether who's a minority or a majority? But in the context of the North, which was set up as a Protestant parliament for a Protestant people, the fact that Protestants are now a minority within this six-county state, it begs the question, what is the purpose of this six-county state? But in some ways, that crisis, if you like, happens at the level of the big politics, and people talk about partition. What is actually happening to working class people in Northern Ireland? And here, it's important to look at how the divisions between Catholic and Protestant workers have had a direct impact on the lives of working class people. in reality, when I looked at figures in the book, one of the things that struck me was that the wages in Northern Ireland are so low compared to the wages in both the Southern Ireland and indeed the UK. In 2019, the wages of Northern Ireland public sector workers was €7 lower than in the UK, while the earnings of the private sector employees in the North were €92 a week on average lower than the UK. And what that means in practice is that many people work in call centres, are earning around £360 a week, or in social care and so on, and poverty is widespread throughout working class communities. About a third of young people are entitled to a free school meal, both Catholic and Protestant. It makes no difference. Poverty makes no difference. And those receiving those school meals, of course, do far worse on their GCSE exams. So the notion that somehow Protestants have benefited from the setup in the North, that is actually being destroyed by the reality on the ground. Now, let's then come back finally to the more recent events. So given this crisis of unionism and given the decline in the DUP vote, what does the Democratic Unionist Party do? And what it does is what it's always done. It gets in touch with the loyalist paramilitaries. It tries to whip up sectarianism. It does the only thing it can do. It tries to re-establish its base by banging the orange drum quicker, or louder rather, by essentially setting in motion a massive conflict about this custom check on the Irish Sea, because our whole identity is being overrun. But the reality is that while it has had some impact, there is no guarantee that the DUP can mobilize the massive number of Protestant workers for their deeply reactionary agenda that will now put them somewhere to the right of Donald Trump. And therefore, in some ways, the stage is opening up for the Irish left. And here I just want to really finish by talking about where the Irish left has come. And really, as somebody who's been around a long time, I can say that for many years, Ireland looked like a hopeless case in terms of left-wing politics, dominated by Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael in the south, dominated by the Unionist Party in the north. But in the recent decades, the left, the radical left, the genuine left in Ireland, has managed to achieve a toehold in the electoral politics of the country, winning, for example, we now have 4 members of parliament in the south, 1 member of parliament in the north, 5 councillors dotted throughout the north. The left has beginning to make an impact, and it's what the left is saying at the moment is going to be crucial. And obviously, I'm a member of People for Profit, and what we've been doing in the last months, our members have been on the streets, discouraging young people from rioting, Catholic against Protestant, Protestant against Catholic, trying to point out that the real problem in the north are those in government, which by the way includes both Sinn Féin and the DUP, who've implemented austerity politics that have attacked working class people. And we're getting a bit of a hearing from that. We had a meeting, for example, with one of the champion boxers in the north, with about 300 people attending it, to call people together to stand up against the virus of sectarianism. But in saying we want to stand up against the virus of sectarianism, we're also honest with people. And we say honestly to people that the existence of 2 states has not served working class people, that we want to see an end to partition. But we want to see an end to partition that does not involve simply the stitching together of 2 rotten states. I mean, when I look at the south, I see a country where 90% of schools are still in the control of the Catholic Church, where if you want to have a hip operation, for example, you'll wait 3 years if you don't have private medical insurance, where this country has become a tax haven so that most multinationals pay in reality less than 2 or 3% of their profits in tax. And that is one of the reasons why Irish people have to put up with some of the highest creche facility fees in Europe. You pay about €1,000 to send your kid to a creche in Dublin, the highest bus fares. After Britain leaves the EU, you'll find that Ireland occupies the position of having the highest university fees. And therefore we say that is not an option that's going to attract Protestant workers away from unionism. And here we're saying something fundamentally different to the politics of Irish nationalism and Irish republicanism. One of the things that's important for people to realise is that Sinn Féin, the party of Irish republicanism, is moving much more clearly to the centre ground. In the South, it still uses the rhetoric about standing up for workers, but when we look at its policy documents, it talks about a united Ireland becoming, and I'm quoting them, a global leader in attracting foreign direct investment in sectors with good prospects. It holds up German unification as the model for the type of unification that Ireland might have. And it combines this rather conservative view with a strange type of love bombing of the Orange Order. So, for example, Sinn Féin now says that there will be recognition of the loyal orders, including the Orange Order, in the cultural life of the nation. Extraordinary stuff coming from a party that does call itself Republican. Now, People Before Profit against this approach stands very much in the tradition of James Connolly. Our vision of a united Ireland, which we think is becoming more possible, is one that is linked to radical transformation. It is not a question of hoping that Irish capitalism can make the South ready and fit for workers from the North to join it. It is rather a question of workers North and South, the left across this island, coming together in a radical movement to challenge both states and form what James Connolly once wanted, was a 32-county socialist republic where working class people gain. That is the vision that we are now putting across in Ireland today.
Thank you so much, Kieran. That was brilliant to hear from you. So now we're going to have a Q&A. I'm going to start off by asking a few questions of my own, but it would be great to hear from everyone that's watching this on any platform. So if you do have questions or comments, just stick them in the comments section and we'll see them and I can read your questions out to Kieran. So the first question that I have for you, Kieran, is that I think for me reading the book, the most exciting part was the chapter on Protestant workers and the examples that you gave of cross-community working class unity from history, because it's in that history that we can sort of see the possibilities for the future. So the question is, what are the prospects or examples today of united working class action in the North?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. For those who have looked at the history, you find that in 1932, massive numbers of Protestants and Catholics riot together. Even, by the way, in the midst of, it's often not known, but in the midst of the Second World War, the biggest strike wave occurred in Belfast, mainly of a Protestant workforce, at a time when people were being told, you must stand up for the empire and do your bit for the empire. What's happening today? Well, Catholic and Protestant workers unite, for example, in the health service to fight against the pathetic wage offer that's been made to nurses and health service workers generally. People fight in the civil service against the sort of imposition of wage restraint. So in many cases, Catholic and Protestant workers unite. And there's no dispute about that. The issue, however, is that when the sectarianism is raged, because the unions often don't take a position, the left is pushed back. And our aim, really, in order to strengthen this unity that exists at an economic level, is to begin to develop a socialist network throughout both Catholic and working class areas that has a very different vision of what Ireland should look like. The vision I've just outlined is I'm essentially representing the vision of People for Profit. That, I think, is what the necessary ingredient is at the moment. The last thing I'd say is this, that when you look at the great battles of working class unity in the past, they were broken up, often because the Orange Order could appeal to a Unionist prime minister, could point to the, if you like, reality of discrimination, could point to the backwardness of the South. And all of this I refer to as a material base that sustained loyalism. Today, however, a lot of that material base is going. And what you're left with is this notion, I have a British identity. And what exactly that British identity is something I think we should very much question.
Thank you very much. So I've got one more question and then I'll definitely take the ones from the comments. So you also point in the book to the amazing movements on the streets for repeal and equal marriage and how they kind of organically express this 32 county consciousness and the cry of the North is next. And I wondered what impact that amazing victory for repeal in the South is having on the struggle for abortion rights in the North today and where that struggle is at.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, there has been many brave campaigners who have spent 10, 20 years in the North fighting for abortion rights, which, even though it was supposed to be part of the so-called United Kingdom, the 1968 Act was never applied to the North. And what I think really happened is that once you had this movement in the South, and it was instinctive that immediately after winning repeal in the South, winning abortion rights in the South, buses were organised to go to Belfast, to Derry, and so on, to begin massive demonstrations. That in turn gave a massive fillip to the pro-choice movement in the North and really put the issue back on the agenda. Now, as it happens, because of the particular structure of the North, if any party says, which is a communal party, because the whole of Northern politics is based on are you Unionist or Nationalist or other, as they call it. But if a party representing the Unionist voice imposes a veto, then you can't have anything. And as a result of that, there was no breakthrough in the North. Now, what happened, of course, was that when the Northern Executive was prorogued, a Labour MP, I forget her name now, brought in a bill which, if you like, extended the Abortion Act to Northern Ireland. Both the DUP and, ironically, Sinn Féin say, well, we don't want this imposed on us. Ironically, particularly in the case of the DUP, we don't want the British House of Commons imposing abortion on Northern Ireland. But nevertheless, the fight has gone on and is actually extending and growing.
Thanks very much, Kieran. So this question is from Gary. He says, of course, socialists support a united Ireland and removal of the British apparatus without question. If a referendum in Ireland, Northern Ireland occurs, as requested in Scotland, what should a socialist response be? Sinn Féin once talked about socialism, but now seems very neoliberal and wants a united Ireland within the EU structure. Okay, well, first of all,
we are very much for a border poll. We are for a referendum. Now, the problem is that under the Belfast Agreement, only the British Secretary for State is able to call such a referendum. So it's almost an example of an imperial arrangement where this overlord, only they have the right to call a referendum. But it's a democratic demand. And particularly given the fact that the main argument made to Republicans who were at that stage involved in an armed struggle, you must have a different way of representing your aspirations, then clearly the demand for a border poll is simply a democratic demand. And very much we are pushing for that. And in fact, you find that the vast majority of people in the South, there will be a referendum in the South as well as the North, are for this demand. So yes, we're very much for a referendum. Our only problem is we don't think it should be in the gift of a Tory minister to decide whether or not there is a referendum. So we'll need more popular pressure, just like, by the way, we had popular pressure for a referendum for marriage equality, and we had popular pressure that delivered us a referendum for repeal.
Thank you. So the next question's from Joe Daly, and he asks, how will the elites north and south of the border try to avoid or delay a border poll? What's their strategy, and how should socialists respond?
Well, the strategy of the elites in the North, by that I mean the Unionist elites, is we will never have a border poll. We don't want to ever question the existence of Northern Ireland. They rely quite heavily on the fact that the Southern establishment also do not want a border poll. And the reason why the Southern establishment do not want the border poll is that they reckon, I think quite correctly, it would destabilize their political arrangements in the South, and therefore they want to push a border poll back. And what their argument is, we're not quite ready for a border poll. It'll have to wait until about 2028. And what we need to do at the moment is have this is the sort of language you get from bourgeois politics these days. We need to have a conversation. Conversation about what? A conversation about exploring each other's identity. And if we only come to explore each other's identity and understand what's happening, then and only then might we be able to have a border poll. We try to cut across that by saying that, first of all, the argument that a border poll is divisive, yes, it is, but every referendum is divisive. A referendum on abortion is divisive. A referendum on whether they're in the EU or not is divisive. Every referendum, by definition, is divisive. That's not an argument against having a referendum. And we want the opportunity in a referendum to be able to present a different vision of what Ireland might look like. And obviously, we want that backed up by a strategy of people power to bring it about.
Thank you. I'm going to maybe ask you a couple of questions because we've got quite a lot coming in, if that's all right. So the first of them is from Dave Sherry, and he asked, what will be the response if the Protestant Parliament for Protestant people has a Sinn Féin majority? And the next question is from someone on Twitter who asks, how has the Black Lives Matter movement impacted in Ireland, and has it influenced things in the north?
Let me just deal with the second question first. The Black Lives Matter. Yeah, Ireland's had initially about 10,000 people took part in the protest in Dublin for Black Lives Matter. In the north, there has been a very significant Black Lives Matter protest that was socially distant. The response of the police force was to go around and issue fines to everybody who took part in that Black Lives Matter protest. The following week, there was a demonstration of loyalists to save our statues, even though nobody was pulling them down, but that's paranoia for you. And what do the police do? They stand aside, joke, isn't that funny, and so on. So Black Lives Matter gets a hard time, and in many ways it gets a hard time because in some strange way the politics of the north is structured around Catholic versus Protestant, and the other, who by the way are a growing minority, about 20% of the population of the north now define themselves as other, they get marginalized and their concerns are pushed to one side. The issue about what would happen if there's a Sinn Féin majority in the north. Well, first of all, strangely enough, not much, because the whole basis of the Good Friday Agreement is you can go into the parliament, you can either be the first minister or the deputy first minister, but you have to recognize the communal the structures of the north, and you're only representing one community and the other is representing the other community, and the other community has a veto. So in practical terms, it doesn't end partition. Obviously, in terms of the DUP and the loyalism, this is used as a great fear. In other words, that you must rally behind the DUP, because if you don't rally behind the DUP, horror of horrors, you will have a Republican leading the north. So they will use that. And I mean, you know, they have been, I wouldn't say successful. They've had some impact in encouraging riots, but they will use for the next year, the elections are due in May 22, they will use this prospect to drive Protestant workers back into the home of the DUP and the right-wing politics that I have outlined.
Brilliant, thank you. So next, Jeannie Robinson asks, can you say more about how our comrades have intervened in the recent riots? And she says, sounds very heroic. And Hugh from Bristol asks, what is the situation regarding Protestant workers in terms of wages, housing versus Catholics? Is the difference much narrower now than decades ago?
The first question, how do we intervene in the riots? Well, as I said, the main riots took place in a road called Lanark Way, which separates the Shankill from the Falls. We have 2 councillors on the Falls Road. Our councillors were out every night, essentially standing in front of young people who are wound up to throw stones at each other, discouraging them, say, listen, don't fight against your fellow worker across the sectarian divide. Turn your anger on those who are causing the poverty, and so on. So, you know, and we also contacted football clubs in both the Falls and the Shankill to bring about unity between Catholic and Protestant workers. The most significant event that happened during the riots, in many ways, obviously not reported by the mainstream media, but on one occasion, a petrol bomb was thrown at a bus full of passengers, almost went into the bus. The day after that, bus drivers walked off their job, gathered in the city centre of Belfast, and showed that we working class people will stand together against the virus of sectarianism. And obviously, we very much supported, went down, talked to the bus drivers about that. What was the second question again? Sorry.
The second question was, what is the situation regarding Protestant workers in terms of wages, housing, and Catholics?
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting question, because look at one of the things that left-wingers need to do is always look reality in the face. So therefore, you know, when I got involved in politics, you could talk about the advantage that Protestant workers had over Catholic workers. And when I actually went and did research for the book, I looked at a lot of the actual statistics. And what you find now, if I can find it, I can actually read it out, is that in the skilled trades, which was normally where the Orange Order had quite a hold, Protestants hold 51% of the jobs versus 49% for Catholics. In the category of associate, professional, and technical occupations, Protestants make up 57% of the employed. Catholics make up 57% of employees, 43% of Protestants. And therefore, if I went on, in reality, the wages of Protestant and Catholic workers are almost equal. The wage of a Protestant, the average earnings, the median average in the north at the moment is £10.58 an hour, and that applies to both Catholic and Protestant. So almost equal wages, very little difference in terms of the older forms of discrimination. That has changed, mainly because of the rise of a mass movement of nationalists that won't accept second-class status. But what that means in reality is that what I call the material base of loyalism, the discrimination, the fact that the Unionist Party is running the place by itself, that has been eroded. And what we're now left with is this ideology that I have a British identity versus your Irish identity, and that is increasingly used as a basis for partition.
Thanks very much. The next two questions, one from David Aiken. How much support in the South is there for a referendum? And from Michael Craig, who asks, do you agree that we need a mass workers or Labour Party based on the trade unions in all of Ireland?
First of all, the question, if I remember the exact, I haven't got the exact figure in front of me, but I think it's about 70% of the southern population support the idea of a referendum. Am I for a mass workers' party based on the trade unions? I wish. But look at the Irish trade unions, to be frank, are disgraceful. I mean, we have had 20 years of social partnership. There's a strike going on at the moment of electricity workers who've walked out of their union, and effectively 600 workers have walked out of their union, joined effectively what you might call a red union. The Irish Congress of Trade Unions is a really conservative body that has backed social partnership for many years. So would I like to see the unions return to what James Connolly and Larkin was for, fighting unions? Absolutely. Are we pushing for this all the time? Yes, we are. We have very much left-wing caucuses in unions pushing for militant action and so on. Do I think that we should wait for the trade union bureaucracy to form a mass workers' party? No, I don't think we should. And I think the whole point of People for Profit is we have stepped into a vacuum that's been left behind by the betrayals of social democracy. And we're growing. We're growing very rapidly at the moment with about 3,000 members across the island. And I don't think it's a matter of waiting for a trade union-based party. It's a matter of really pushing ahead and obviously open to any possibility that emerges from the unions in the future.
Thanks, Kieran. So the next question is from Jim Barlow. He asks, how will the prospect of a vote for independence in Scotland, assuming it can be achieved, impact the fight for reunification of Ireland? And actually, maybe I'll, if it's all right, I'll add my own question onto that, which was, I'm speaking from Glasgow, and here there's the fight for independence is really tied to illusions in the EU. So to what extent is that the case in Ireland, and how much would that hinder the possible transformation into a socialist republic?
Well, first of all, I think a Scottish referendum. Sorry, first of all, a victory for the SNP, which I assume is going to happen, and then the growing pressure for a referendum, which I presume Mr. Johnson will say you can't have it because I'm the master here. But I presume that will build into popular pressure, and I hope at some stage there is a referendum, and that Scottish people, by direct action, by civil disobedience, carry through this fight for a referendum and separate from the UK. That would be a tremendous boon for Irish unification, because what it would do would, it would weaken the British state, the state which is, by the way, it's still the 6th biggest economy in the world. If I remember, when I calculated it, has been involved in about 12 different wars since the 2000. It would weaken that state, weaken its authority in the world, and therefore throw open the whole question of Irish unity. So I think it would be very beneficial for the battle against partition in Ireland. What about the EU? That's an important question, because one of the sort of trends of a left that have become demoralized over the years is to somehow assume that the EU is a wonderful progressive place. I mean, I have to continually remind people, you give out about Trump's wall between Mexico and the United States? What about the thousands of people who've drowned in the Mediterranean because of the wall around the EU? Or anybody who thinks the EU is progressive? Look what they did to the people of Ireland during the crash of 2008. We were told by a man called Jean-Claude Trichet, the head of the European Central Bank, that we, the people, had to pick up the bill for the speculators and the bankers who squandered 64 billion. We had to pay for that in order to make sure that the bank funds of the French and German and, for that matter, British banks were not depleted. So the idea that the EU operates as some sort of progressive state is completely wrong, and in many ways has infected, I know the arguments about Brexit, one of the great illusions that people in the Remain side have often had is somehow the EU is a progressive institution. I would argue the EU embeds neoliberalism into its structures by virtue of the fact, for example, it restricts public spending. So that is wrong, very much any notion of the EU. But unfortunately, it is the case. The SNP in Scotland think that the big attraction for Scottish independence is we can get back into the EU. And similarly, Sinn Féin in Ireland, who originally campaigned against the EU, took an EU critical position, are now increasingly saying that with our allies in Europe, we can bring about Irish unification as a backdoor into getting into the EU. Now, think about it. It is the case that some of liberal unionists, who, by the way, voted for Remain, the prospect of getting back into the EU might be quite important for them. But is it more important than sticking with the British state where they're plugged into in terms of the upper professionals who deal with the administration of the British state? I doubt it. In terms of Protestant workers, they're the people we're really concerned about. What would the EU offer you? That you have to restrict public spending when you have a limited health service? That you are not allowed to nationalize any capitalist company by rules of the EU, and therefore you must put up with the fact we have a tax haven here? I don't see how that's going to attract Protestant workers. So the left will not be posing the question of Irish unity in terms of this is a backdoor into the EU. We will be posing the question of Irish unity in terms of a radical transformation of the island of Ireland, and hopefully linking up with all movements across Europe to defeat global capitalism.
Thanks very much, Kieran. The next question I've got to you is from Vince, and he asks, when living in Dublin between 2005 and 15, I was struck by the fact that for most in the Republic, the border wasn't really an issue. For many now in the Republic, it's the North that seems an economic basket case and unification more of a hassle, both for the politics and the economics. Has that opinion changed much in the Republic since Brexit?
I think you're correct to say that in the period you're talking about, there wasn't much interest in the North, partially because, remember, the armed struggle of the IRA, while it had some support in the North amongst nationalists, obviously, it left the population of the South cold. I mean, if you are in Ballymurphy and you see your son or daughter beaten up by the British Army, you could see why you would have a kind of a passive support for the IRA attack on the British Army. But if you're living in Ballyfahan in Cork and there's a bombing campaign in the city centre of Belfast, I mean, you just say, well, what's the point of that? Why am I for it? And therefore, for many years, there was a turning away of the southern population from almost a revulsion from the north. That was very much added to by the state strategy through the National Television Service, RTE, which banned under a censorship act, Republican voices were banned from RTE. So in that period, there was quite a lot of alienation from the north. I detect that amongst younger Irish people, that is changing, very much changing. And if you like, the poll that's in support of border poll would be one indication of that. The second element of the question is, isn't the North an economic basket case, and would it be seen as trouble for the South? And that is the way conventional bourgeois politicians pose it. They talk about, for example, that Britain provides a 9 billion subvention each year to the North, and how would Southern Ireland possibly be able to deal with that subvention? Problem is, when you look at subvention, half of that subvention involves costs from Northern Ireland to the British Army, to the British Diplomatic Service, to the Queen, which presumably we would not be paying if you had a united Ireland. Secondly, the North is very much an isolated economy. It is true that levels of capitalist investment in the North, despite all the prospect of the Good Friday Agreement, have not reached the levels they would do, and therefore, to some extent, it is an a capitalist failure. That doesn't mean, however, that a different type of Ireland, which, if you like, took control of capital, took control of investment, took it out of the hands of those who simply wanted to dodge tax, could not produce genuine economic development. And moreover, even if there are discrepancies, I mean, there's a discrepancy between London and Newcastle. There's a discrepancy between Dublin and Donegal. Donegal is a less developed county than Dublin. That's not an argument for separating out a country on the basis of crude type of economic calculations.
Thanks. And I guess off the back of the last two questions about attitudes in the South and the EU, my question would be, to what extent are people in the South disgruntled with the EU after the way that they were treated after the crash?
I wish I could say they were terribly disgruntled, but unfortunately people's memories are sometimes short. And when you see the process, I mean, you have to understand what Boris Johnson represents to people outside of Britain. I know he has some base amongst British electors, but to Irish people in particular, the idea of an upper class twit running a country, I mean, he's repugnant, right? And therefore the idea, and the way Brexit is presented in Ireland is these are the stupid, racist, British workers who've gone along with the Tory policy. That's the way the media presents it. I don't agree with that. I think that it's much more complex in terms of why people voted Brexit and so on. But given a choice between this type of Brexit led by Boris Johnson and we want to go back to imperial greatness and the EU, if that's your choice, unfortunately, support for the EU has risen, unfortunately, even though the EU did terrible things to the Irish people.
Thanks, that makes sense. So I've got a couple more questions. One from Gary, who says, are we seeing class alliances between young people in the North, in particular around women's and LGBT issues? And another one from Twitter, in the past, there was a level of support for the struggles in the North of Ireland. This seems to be forgotten now. What can we in the UK do now to support a united Ireland?
Well, first of all, is there a growing number of younger people who are moving on issues to do with abortion and LGBTQ rights? Absolutely. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the first gay pride demonstration in Dublin when I think there was about 50 of us on it. These days, it's a massive corporate event, maybe 10,000 people, and the same in Belfast. So Belfast is a huge gay pride march. The terrible opportunist politician, Leo Varadkar, who, by the way, originally opposed gay marriage and then came out as gay, turned up at the gay pride demonstration in Belfast because it was so big. So there's a huge constituency across the North that despises what the DUP are talking about when they say that God made man and woman and only all this nonsense, right? We have to get a conversion therapy for dealing with gay people. There's a huge audience of Protestant young people and Catholic young people who despise this sort of stuff. And on the question of women's rights, I mean, again, you have to appreciate the irony. So here we have people with a fervent British identity telling us that the British House of Commons cannot give a woman's right to choose in the North because only us Protestant fundamentalists or Catholic fundamentalists, we're the people who decide whether a woman gets a right to choose. Now, again, I mean, the number of young people who are opposed to this nonsense is huge. And what that is reflected in probably one of the less talked about developments. People talk about the binaries of the Catholic and Protestants. Actually, to repeat, I think, a point I've made, one of the biggest growing categories in the North at the moment is other. In other words, you are asked to define yourself, in various surveys and so on, or even for that matter, a census often asks you, and you define yourself as other, meaning I refuse to be identified as nationalist or unionist. I refuse to be identified as Catholic or Protestant. That reflects a big movement. And I should also say it's a movement of also migrant workers. There's been a lot of recruitment of migrant workers into the meat plants of the north and so on. And again, these don't fit into the binary category. So what we're talking about, we're really 100 years on from partition, we're talking about a very different north from the idea of a Protestant parliament to a Protestant, for a Protestant people. And the idea that somehow there's something called Britishness, which in reality is identified with support for the security forces, the Queen as a defender of the Protestant religion. I mean, who in Britain thinks the Queen is a defender of the Protestant religion? Do people know what religion she even has? Are you interested? So this is dying in terms of Britain, and therefore you're finding a lot of opposition to that. And so when we challenge the notion, you say you have a British identity. What exactly is a British identity is? How does it relate to people in actual Britain at the moment, mainland Britain, as you call it? So I think there's a lot of opposition to this sort of stuff developing in the north.
Brilliant. So I've got one more question of my own, which is that throughout the book, you point to the spirit of the repeal movement, equal marriage movement, and Black Lives Matter, and those things as something that can point to how we move forward towards a united Ireland. But what role can socialists play in transforming those kind of like single issue, spontaneous movements into something focused that can achieve this more whole scale transformation of society?
Well, that's the big question. I mean, what you find with social movements, whether it's the Occupy movement or the Black Lives Matter, is they emerge very, very quickly. I mean, the demonstrations are absolutely huge. Support for these demonstrations is huge. If you talk about the repeal movement, now again, just put it in terms of the size of population, Dublin is about 1 million people. So you look at the repeal demonstrations, you're talking about 30,000 people on the streets of Dublin demanding repeal. These are huge movements. And what tends to happen is, I mean, we were very much involved in the campaign for repeal, setting up many different local groups. The group my area, we had about 200 people out canvassing. But then you ask, where are 200 people now? And the institutional structures of the repeal movement has gone. But that you still leave a network and a memory, so that when, for example, they're setting up a national maternity hospital, and there's a debate about is it going to be on the site of a hospital run by the nuns, you can find there's very quick mobilizations on the issue of that. So a social movement often arises very rapidly, then declines, leaves a memory behind, and leaves a culture, and leaves a reference point behind, but it's not there, if you like. People often say, we want to continue the repeal movement, but it's not quite as simple as that. And therefore, what I think the left has to do is to look to people in the repeal movement and the marriage equality movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, and show them that there is a political party which is taking up these struggles. So if you look at the Irish Parliament, the only party that talks about getting the church out of sex education is People Before Profit. When a young black man, Georgianchenko, was murdered by the police, right? Murdered, shot dead. Who is the only party that gets up in the parliament and says, right, we demand an inquiry into his murder, is People Before Profit. So we see ourselves very much as the party of the movements. And of course, the crucial movement is the workers' movement, which hasn't yet begun to move because of the terrible union leadership that is promoting peace and class conciliation. But it's beginning, small beginning, as mentioned, the ESB strike today. So our aim is to bring these movements, bring the best elements of these movements together for a radical agenda, for right to pro-choice rights, for movements on the environment. We're the people who advocate free public transport. We advocate the nationalisation of the agri-industry to begin to make a transition to a different type of farming, so that Ireland is not the world's great polluter, which it is at the moment in terms of its agricultural industries, small country, but per head of population. So we try to take up the themes of the movement. But we do say to people honestly, in order to achieve your goals, you are going to come up against the limits of capitalism. You're particularly going to come up against the limits of tax haven Irish capitalism, and therefore you need a political party that groups together the militants, that, if you like, works out a strategy of how we're going to take this capitalist regime apart. And that is what People for Profit and inside the Socialist Worker Network is really very much promoting, pushing for to do.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That's a brilliant answer. So I would just remind everybody that you can order Kieran's book from Bookmarks Bookshop. Here, yeah, there, you can see it there. And I just want to thank everyone before we bring Kieran back in to make any closing remarks. I want to thank everybody who asked questions in the chat, everybody who tuned in. It's been a fantastic and fascinating to hear from you, Kieran. We've already sold 15 copies of the book today, many of them during this talk. So that's brilliant. So yeah, I'll just hand over to you. Thank you so much. Any closing remarks you want to make, Kieran?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. Secondly, really, for one question I didn't answer was, what can socialists in Britain do? And I mean, in the past, socialists in Britain were often moralized into, why aren't you taking a strong enough stance in support of the Republican movement fighting British imperialism? I think that's slightly changed these days, because the Republican movement is very much managing the northern state at the moment. That's not the issue. What I would think the socialists in Britain need to do is to fight for socialism in Britain, to destroy the Tories. And I would have thought the big challenge, and I'm sure you know more about it than I do, facing the left in Britain is, how do you relate to those many, many people that thought that Jeremy Corbyn, poor man, that was imprisoned in the Labour Party, he was going to have to he was going to try to bring about a change in Britain. They had all the best of intentions. They were in the wrong party. And what we need to do is to develop a movement in Britain that is not stuck with the pathetic sight of Starmer, and is offering a genuine radical left. So what I hope happens in Britain at some stage, and I keep being told I'm premature, I'm a bit too previous on this, is that some broad left movements emerges outside the dreadful Labour Party that is offering a real prospect of left-wingers coming together and debating, how the hell do we destroy this Tory rule in Britain? That would be the best prospect for moving things forward in Ireland, I think.
Brilliant. Thanks, everybody. And see you at the next week's book event, which I think you can see on the screen now, A.L. Kennedy. Yeah, go and buy the book. Okay. Bookmarks Bookshop.
Okay.
Bye now. Bye, Kieran.
Bye, Ruby.